Hi, and welcome everyone to this Axiomatics webinar. Today we'll be talking about making authorization simple so that you can integrate your applications and APIs with Axiomatics and externalized authorization. Today we are two speakers. We have Jonas Iggbom on the line from California. Good afternoon, Jonas.
Good afternoon, David.
All right, so let's get this show going. So what's the big deal? Why do we want to make authorization simple? We're developing more and more applications, right? A lot of businesses are focusing on IT and trying to deliver applications to serve their customers. And that's across the board. It could be in manufacturing, it could be in pharmaceutical, it could be in banking. You have to deliver, say, a microservice or a new API or share data with your customers or a single page application or a mobile app. There's many different things that you want to develop in order for your business to progress. And as far as of developing these applications, you need to handle things like authentication and logging and authorization. I like to call those non-functional requirements. They're not really the stuff that you want to focus on, but they're things, unfortunately, that you have to deal with. And you want to make them in a way that doesn't get in the way of your users actually benefiting from the application. So you want smooth, seamless authentication. You want logging that will help your administrators understand what's happening in the app. And you also want authorization that reflects your business logic, authorization that helps your users use the application the right way, but also helps your owners and your administrators control what information is being shared. And I think it's fair to say, Jonas, that authorization is not just about security, but it's really a mix between business and security, right? Getting the requirements on the business side tied together with compliance regulations, with security concerns, with privacy concerns.
And it scales sort of the entire application stack too, right? So it goes sometimes all the way from UI layer type of authorization down to the data tier. And, you know, we got databases to deal with, authorization for information, potentially big data type of solutions and controlling access to data in there as well. So it spans sort of a broad spectrum of any application implementation. And these days, it's not only the application itself either, right? So you get into microservices and specific specialized components running as microservices. And obviously as well, APIs is a big part of applications as a whole today. So authorization around APIs is an important aspect too.
Yeah, so it's actually the depth of your layers, like you said, from the presentation tier all the way to your data tier, but also the breadth of your applications from on-prem to cloud applications to microservices to, say, Amazon APIs or Lambda functions. And I believe you've been working on that particular part of the equation as well, right? Integrating AWS with Axiomatics authorization services.
Yeah, I mean, we constantly try to move ourselves forward the landscape of identity and access management, and we've had integrations with several API gateways purely from a configurational standpoint for quite some time. We're kind of getting into that specific part as well with the AWS API gateway. That's a fairly new sort of project that we're embarking on, and it looks pretty promising so far.
Cool. And that obviously is going to help us achieve centralized, externalized authorization, which makes it scalable. And I like to call it future-proof in the sense that given your authorization is not expressed as code within your app or within your microservice or within your data tier, but because it's expressed as a policy, it's easier to update that policy instead of updating the code.
That's a huge part, whether it's an API gateway or an application or what have you, right? It's a critical part of that piece is the fact that it is externalized. And you know, when I've been working on this Lambda function for the AWS API gateway, you could write all of it into the code of the Lambda function, but that's not going to scale, to your point, right?
Yeah.
So you want to externalize that because you want the policy to be external from that authorization type of function. Otherwise, I would have to rewrite the code for every little thing, right? So you want that external, and you want the policy to be changeable externally, and as well as that being able to operate in a scalable manner, in the sense that there might be a lot of these authorization decisions happening, right? So you want to be able to scale the externalized authorization engine as well.
Yeah. I think that's kind of the whole point of today's webinar, is to show how we can easily do that. Because when as you know, I spend a lot of time on developer websites like Stack Overflow, and on those websites, you realize that, well, people are still trying to design their own authorization model from scratch, or they're relying on legacy techniques like role-based access control, which has its merits, but doesn't really scale to today's IT environment or IT ecosystem. And of course, you could, like you said, you could hard code the authorization logic within your app. So the whole idea is that you shouldn't have to write authorization code within your API layer or within your database, but rather you want to externalize it, decouple it, externalize it, and put it somewhere else.
Yeah, I think it's important there to say too that, we're not saying that roles are going away, right? Roles are always going to be there, but from an RBAC architectural perspective, there are authorization logic that you cannot really express, right? And that comes into sort of the more modernized architectures that we're looking at when it comes to APIs, mobile applications, Internet of Things, more use cases around sharing your data with partners and customers in different ways, right? So
yeah.
I think it's been sort of, there is this notion that RBAC, in some ways it kind of works, but it works for the simple type of use cases. We've all heard about role explosions, and the role explosions is trying to fix these more complicated, or when you're trying to fix the more complicated use cases, you end up in some kind of role explosion, and that's what you can actually alleviate with something that we're talking about here, right?
Yeah, and speaking of role explosion, here are a couple of typical questions that I see on Stack Overflow. So here's a great example where the person is building a REST API to get access to a list of machines, and the user is trying to get access to only those machines that the user owns. But that's a typical relationship that in ABAC, in the way Axiomatics works, can be handled easily, but in RBAC would lead to role explosion. You can see also,
it's one of the more common sort of scenarios that we get into and talk about, right? The relational type of policy expression. And it's funny, and you can probably show it later when we actually write a live policy in the demo, how it's funny how easy it looks in ABAC, right? It's sort of, you're comparing two things, right? And that's it. Whereas in an RBAC model, it's virtually impossible to express.
Correct, yeah. And we'll see that in the example when we get to it in the alpha language. Some other examples here. Another question where a user is asking about the best practices for designing a role and permission system. So this is the sort of stuff that we don't want developers to have to think about. You really want to just put it inside a policy and, check that box, it's done. And guess what? It's also future-proof, because we've been thinking about these problems for the last 10, 15 years. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's really important to stay away from that. And then another example here is yet another model where the user is trying to imagine operations, resources, permissions to try to handle the different access control scenarios. All of these can be easily expressed through policy. So when I see that, Jonas, I don't know about you, I drink a lot of coffee to try to stay awake throughout the day. I'm like, yeah, it's not going to work that well. So we need to come up with a new approach. And that new approach, I think we've already mentioned it, right, is to decouple your app code from your authorization logic, to let developers focus on their app, make it really nice and lean, very efficient, very customer-driven, very end-user focused, and then let the security developers or the other developers focus on the authorization requirements, maybe even the business analysts or the application owners, and they're going to be responsible for identifying the policies and the attributes that you want to use in your applications. And then all you need to do is integrate your apps, be it microservices, APIs, web pages, portals, SharePoint, you name it, with your externalized authorization service with your policy decision points. That makes sense?
Makes absolute sense. Yeah. I mean, you want the developers to focus on what the application is going to be about, right? Pretty much to your first point there, like, take away the sort of the non-functional aspects as much as possible so that they can focus their energy, time, and expertise on writing the best application for what the application is supposed to do, rather than focusing time on other things that are just a necessity, right?
Yeah. So to your point, we could summarize it into 3 words, right? Reuse, reduce, and recycle. It's don't reinvent the wheel. Just have this common authorization layer, and then no matter what you're writing, whether it's a data service or an API or something else, you just go to that central point to grab your authorization decisions and bam, implement that authorization within your app. And the whole point really, Jonas, is we want to focus on simplicity, right? Security is scary enough as it is. We shouldn't make it any more complex. So anything that we can do to make integration, to make expressing, to make implementing simpler is what we should aim for.
Right. Yeah. As soon as it becomes complicated, you are also, I think, more prone to kind of make some mistakes somewhere. So simple is definitely good, right? So keep it simple. I think that's the name of the game here for sure.
So what are the three basic tools we're going to be using to make to do that, Jonas? Can you tell us a bit more about ALFA?
Yeah. So ALFA is short for abbreviated language for authorization. It's something that Axiomatics came up with several years ago, actually, but we have since essentially sort of handed over to the OASIS Technical Committee for Standardization. As far as I know, we are the only ones still that have any type of implementation of it so that it's actually usable. But ALFA is, we can say, C#-like syntax of expressing attribute-based access policies. So what essentially happens is you have a domain-specific pseudo language to express authorization policies. And in our world, still, we have that we'll look at later, we have a plugin for Eclipse that can be leveraged to author policies using the ALFA language, and it will produce XACML policies out of that. So the benefit here is obviously that the ALFA notation is a lot easier to read, understand than what it produces, which is sort of raw XACML, right? Nobody wants to actually even look at that or write it. So that's the part of the simplicity of ALFA, right? Is that it's actually readable and usable.
Yeah, you could actually literally copy paste it inside of reports and documents when you're sharing authorization information with different colleagues and customers, right?
Right, which we do on a regular basis too when we write blog posts and things like that. When we want to exemplify a policy, it's fairly simple to take a little snippet out of ALFA code, and I mean, you don't even have to be a developer to some degree understand what that policy would do, right?
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So that's the first part to the equation, right? But the second part here is JSON. So it's kind of along the same lines, right, Jonas? ALFA is like a human readable version of XACML XML. Well, JSON is also a human readable version of the request response.
Exactly. I mean, because otherwise, usually the alternative that we look at is XML, right? So that's going to be very kind of verbose. You can still, as a human read it, but it's definitely not easy. It's verbose and it's kind of complicated to follow. Definitely, if you compare it to what the JSON format of essentially what we're going to look at here, an authorization request and an authorization response would look like.
Cool. And then the last part, of course, is REST. And that the whole idea is that back in the days, of course, you'd use protocols like RMI, and then later you had SOAP, and then you had other types of bindings which were pretty heavy and pretty, required a lot of plumbing. REST sort of did away with all those, right? And all you have to do is literally post a JSON request in this case, and you get a JSON authorization response back. So it makes the communication, the plumbing, a lot more lightweight.
Right, and then with these combined, ALFA doesn't really necessarily matter from this perspective, but the bottom two then, JSON and REST, you kind of also not only making it more simple, but opening it up to being able to implement this enforcement in almost any type of coding language, as long as it can actually handle JSON and has the capability of posting that JSON to a REST interface, which today is going to be, you'll have a lot of options in terms of what programming language you want to do that in, right?
Yeah. And as a matter of fact, fun story, one of our developers wanted to integrate with Salesforce the other day, and he tried to use this SOAP interface, and the WSDL translator within Salesforce couldn't handle the complexity of the WSDL, so he switched to REST, and then it was just a piece of cake to just get the Salesforce client to call out to the Axiomatics PDP because of the simplicity of the JSON REST interface. So what is ALFA? I think you hit all the points, Jonas. You mentioned it was simplified C# language. It's very easy to write. We'll see it live in action. Most of the keywords that exist in XACML will also exist in ALFA, things like policy set, policy, and role. So those familiar with XACML will be extremely familiar with ALFA. And if you're familiar with ALFA, you'll be able to learn XACML pretty quickly. A couple of points I want to highlight is the fact that there is a lot of literature and documentation both on Wikipedia and Stack Overflow on ALFA, and we welcome contributions from anyone. So if you want to go to those pages and add more information, you can do that. And then Jonas, you briefly mentioned the ALFA plugin for Eclipse. What is it exactly?
So it's the component that provides sort of the editor capabilities inside of Eclipse, and provides the capability of authoring ALFA policies inside of Eclipse to begin with. So it brings the capability of writing ALFA policies inside of Eclipse. But with that comes also obviously some sort of pretty printing in terms of syntax coloring and things like that makes it even easier to read. Yep. And autocomplete is a huge one too, obviously, with, for example, combining algorithms and policies and all sorts of keywords you get autocomplete for, which if you are uncertain about some things, you can actually leverage the autocomplete to kind of tell you or suggest to you what is missing at that specific point in the policy.
Nice.
And then syntax checking as well, that you got the correct sort of function names and things like that could help with the autocomplete could actually help with that to begin with. But then what ends up happening when you write the ALFA code, and what the plugin does is it performs in sort of on the fly compilation or conversion, translation of the ALFA code into XACML 3.0 conformant policies. And so this happens on the fly. It's not something that you have to tell the plugin to do necessarily.
Cool. So we'll see that in action in a couple minutes.
Yep.
So one of the feedback we received, and like you said, Jonas, ALFA is something we've been working for quite a few years. So this is a quote that's a little over 2 years old from Gartner, and it's the fact that simplifying XACML through simplifying the policy expression is going to go a long way in the adoption of externalized authorization. So that's great to see such glowing feedback from the likes of Gartner.
Yeah, and I think this is something that pops up from time to time, right? That I think there's the notion, especially when you start talking about XACML, the notion that policy authoring could be complicated. And I think that kind of stems from the fact that the raw format of it is, the XACML raw format is fairly verbose and complex to handle and at least read. I mean, I know that we do actually have customers that write policies by hand in text editors like that, but that is far from what is needed from sort of a broader adoption standpoint. So that's where ALFA and sort of some type of UI type policy authoring tools could help with. But ALFA is obviously the one that goes sort of closer to the hearts of developer-minded policy authors.
Right. So the second part to this trio of simplifying authorization is REST. And I think we summarized it pretty well on the slide earlier. The whole point of using REST is to do away with the heavy plumbing, right? Just quite simply cut out the soap, cut out anything that you don't need, and post a standard request. It could be XML. Of course, we like JSON better. We think it's more lightweight. And just post it out to your authorization service, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you cut sort of it's another sort of verboseness in SOAP that gets simplified here a lot. And I think as soon as you get into REST, you can kind of get some simpler testing tools to leverage and whatnot as well.
Yep.
And you know, one thing that it's actually very sort of clearly shows the simplicity of this too, I think, is that almost any of the API gateways that we work with that I mentioned in the beginning, that we have had integrations with from a pure configuration standpoint, that comes a lot from the fact that the API gateways have native capabilities of, you know, just connecting to a REST service, right? So, and since they also have built-in capabilities of just constructing a JSON payload, then all of a sudden you have these two components that you need, right? They need to construct a JSON payload to send to a REST interface, which is, in that case, the REST interfaces are PDP, and they send a JSON payload, which is the authorization request. So that has certainly helped in broadening sort of the number of API gateways that we integrate with without having to write any code on our side or for the integration itself. It's just out of the box, right?
Yep. And as a matter of fact, speaking of simplification and speaking of being able to integrate with more languages, here's an example that we wrote in plain old JavaScript. So this is an example of client-side JavaScript running in your browser, and all we're doing is using an XML HTTP request to create a JSON request to the endpoint. So the endpoint here is my localhost endpoint, and we're going to be posting a XACML request read from the HTML page, and you can see that all we need to do is pretty much this one line where you create the request, then you define that it's a post request, you define the authorization header for authentication, you define the content type and the accept headers, so application XACML plus JSON is a dedicated type for the XACML profile, the JSON profile of XACML rather. So it's very simple. In these few lines, boom, you've posted your authorization request.
Yeah, and I think this is sort of, you can take this and translate it into other ways of posting the request in a similar way. The key items here is what you're pointing out, right? It's the URL, obviously. You need to tell it where to send the request, right? So that's one part. That's a key part. You have to tell it what you're doing, which is a post in this case, right? And then comes two other pieces, but here they're bundled together somewhat. But it's you got to specify the content type, and then there's obviously an authorization that tells you that you're allowed to invoke that endpoint there or talk to that endpoint, to the PDP, right? You can take those pieces and put them into Postman or something else, and that's all you need, right?
And it also simplifies testing because you can use tools like Postman, SoapUI, or other tools that'll help you create tests and also automate those tests and do regression testing. So it's not just about simple integration, it's also about simplifying other parts of the authorization lifecycle. So the JSON profile of XACML is something that we wrote, I want to say 3 years ago, maybe. It's a pretty close mirror of the XACML request response. The whole idea is to get rid of all the fluff that you don't really need. In XACML, you have to be extremely blunt and explicit about the fact that, an attribute is a string attribute. It describes the subject, it describes the resource, so on and so forth. In JSON, you're going to be able to use reasonable defaults. So you're going to be able to skip things. Like you don't have to say an attribute is a string. By default, it is a string. You're going to be able to leverage the JavaScript data types, numerical values, so integer and double, string, boolean. And if you're using another data type, which barely happens, but say you're using URI or an X500 name, then you could specify those. So you still have the full richness of XACML, but the simplicity of JSON, the simplicity of a much simpler authorization request. Also, using default category names helps the request be more readable. instead of having complex identifiers that stem from the core spec of XACML, you have those simpler names. So that really helps. Which means in turn, Jonas, that if I create a XACML request in JSON using JavaScript, this pretty much is what the code looks like. It's very small, right? And here we're benefiting from the fact that you can directly serialize a JavaScript object into its JSON representation. So here I'm creating a new object. I'm adding a new category, the access subject part. And then on that, I'm adding a new attribute. And then I have a sub function called create attribute. And here's the detail of the sub function. All we do is create a new object, give it an identifier, give it a value, and that's it. We're good to go. So here we're saying, I want to be the user called Alice, and I'm going to call my attribute employee ID, and the value is going to be the value Alice. That's pretty simple to understand, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is very straightforward, right? And I mean, although here it's a fairly small request, but even if you would build this out and you would create a request with a couple of attributes in it, it still wouldn't be that complex to handle, right? And then couple this with the code that we just looked at for actually sending the request. You know, it's simple.
Yep. So how about we do a live demo, just tie it all together and see it in action.
Yeah, that's probably what everyone wants to see.
Exactly. Forget the rest. So here I'm within Eclipse. Right now I'm using Eclipse Oxygen 3. I just downloaded it today, as a matter of fact. And I'm within a project called Example Alpha. I have a folder called Source Alpha that contains my source for my alpha files. And I have another folder called Source Gen. It's currently empty. And that Source Gen folder is going to contain the XACML policies once I've generated them. So if we want to write a policy, we could just do Control Space or Command Space on a Mac, and then I can start typing policy. And you can see the autocomplete, like Jonas said. And I'm going to do a little bit of a tab so it's a little easier to read. I'm going to say example. And then, assuming I'm using the right keyboard and not the Swedish keyboard, I can put curly braces in place. And then inside of that, I can do Control Space again, and it's offering me to complete. And I can say, well, I'm going to add something called the combining algorithm. So combining algorithms are some things you use in XACML to be able to combine together multiple children, because you could have a policy, you could have multiple rules inside that one rule could say permit, one rule could say deny, so you have to define which one wins. So that's what the combining algorithm is about. And here below, I'm going to go ahead and insert my rule, and I'm going to say rule allow all. Great. And since I called it allow all, I'm going to say permit. And I think that's a pretty simple, straightforward example. That's actually the smallest policy you could write. It's 8 lines of code, and what it does is that it grants everyone access. And what you could do is add comments as well. So here you can say grant everyone access, because as we know, good documentation is everyone's friend.
It's very straightforward. And you know, this is what I meant with the autocomplete and how it can help too. You know, you see that apply first applicable, even if you don't even, now you knew that there's a combining algorithm called first applicable, so you started typing FIR and it autocompleted, but you can hit Control Space or Command Space right there, and you actually get a list of them, and they are pretty self-explanatory what they do and how they like combines the decisions, right?
Yeah.
But that it's simple, right? And you have the information right there. So as you can see now, what's happened here is that as David has been writing the alpha code, the plugin has automatically generated an XML artifact in the source gen folder. This is the actual XACML policy that it has produced from this alpha code.
And from there, what we can do is one-click deploy the policy by simply right-clicking on it and going to upload XACML policy, and just following the different prompts that you get. So this is one of the things we've done to bridge the gap between the developers, the dev environment, the DevOps, and the infrastructure, so to make it really simple and streamlined to handle authorization. So here I'm going to package my policies and upload them. And then what's going to happen here is it's going to show me the list of projects that currently exist. I'm going to pick my default project here, and then I'm going to click OK. And then it's going to ask me whether I want to create a new authorization domain or an existing one. I'm going to pick an existing one. I'm going to pick my sample domain. This is where my PDP resides. I'm going to pick that one, click OK, and then boom, it's just pushed the policy out to my authorization service. So this is quite cool, Jonas, because now if you want to test the policy, all we have to do is send a JSON authorization request. And given that the policy says permit, we should get a permit back no matter what we send.
And then in addition to this, I mean, you have sort of a simplified view here a little bit because it's a demo environment, right? But
Yep.
if you imagine that you are a developer of the client-side application and you want to test some things out here, you have written a policy. I mean, what you just did, deployed the policy that you just wrote to, for example, a dev environment PDP, right?
Yeah.
So if, you know, we're going to go in and potentially look at the policy and try to send a sample request to it. But what you can switch to now is testing your application and make sure that it's actually working as it's supposed to with the policy that you just wrote, right? So it's integrating all of those aspects without you having to, essentially in this case, leave Eclipse.
Yeah. So as a matter of fact, I could have, and I don't in this particular example, but I could have a JUnit test within my source folder that I would use to verify the effect of the policy. In this case, though, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a little web portal, really, that creates the authorization for requests for me and then just post them to the PDP. So I call it X-Ray. It's a cute little name that we came up with because it can sort of see through the policies. So you can see here that I have my sample domain, okay? And if I click on Browse Attributes, it's not going to return anything because my policy is empty right now. But that's okay. We can still send an authorization request. And here is going to let me post a request to my PDP. So I'm going to click on Send Authorization Request. And look at that. Right below, we have access granted. And if we look at the request, it's an empty request. Well, yeah, because we didn't really need any attributes, did we? So it doesn't really matter what we send in terms of attributes. Given the policy would allow anyone access, it returned access permitted. And we can see the detail of the response by simply clicking on the response tab. And here you can see that your decision is permit.
And this is sort of, obviously in its absolute simplest form is what we did. To your point, we wrote the smallest and simplest possible policy that we could ever do, I think.
So let's crank it up a notch. Let's go back to my, my policy, and let's just say that my policy is about medical records. It's always medical records, isn't it? So here I'm going to say target, and now I'm going to start using attributes. So I'm going to say object type is equal to medical records. Okay, and you can see here that it's highlighting the word object type in red, and that means that it doesn't know what the attribute is, right? So I need to define the attribute.
That's correct. And that's, I mean, obviously another help that you get from the ALFA plugin, that it's pointing that out to you.
So here I'm going to go ahead and add my attribute. So this is where you want to do a bit of your authorization modeling. What does your object type represent? Well, it's the resource category, and the ID is going to be, well, let's just call it object type for now. And then the type is going to be, well, you don't really have to think too hard because the tool, like you said, Jonas, helps you every step of the way. So here I can just go ahead and say, oh, there's a string type. Well, there we go. Boom. So now we're writing a policy about medical records. So if you're trying to get access to a medical record, access is going to be granted. We're not discriminating yet. So then now that we've added additional attributes, I can just go ahead and push my policy, right? So I'm going to upload it to my ASM, and I'm going to say yes, package and upload. And then I'm going to choose the same project, of course. And I'm going to use the same existing domain. So I'm going to pick my sample domain, click OK. That pushes it. Great. And now if I go back to my little client, Jonas, what I can do is simply go back to my list of authorization domains, click on send a PEP request, and now it determines that there's something called object type that I need to send. So here I can simply type banking account. And if I do that, what do you think is going to come back?
I forget what combining algorithm you had, but it's not going to be permit.
Yeah, so it's not applicable. I don't have anything else. So not applicable is going to be the answer. But if I use medical record, then it's going to be permit. Boom, perfect. So now we can start progressing in our policies. And something that you mentioned that was really interesting to me, Jonas, was the fact that you can use relationships so that the authorization can grow very quickly without you having to grow the policy. So I'm going to say doctors can view assigned patients' records. So I'm going to update my description, by the way, not that it matters, but grant doctors the ability to view the medical records of those patients they have a care relationship with. So notice how business requirement is directly mirrored into the authorization policy. So it kind of bridges the gap between business and IT, which is really cool. So here I'm going to say user.role is equal to doctor. And then I'm going to add a condition, and the condition is going to be user.username must be equal to patient.assigned doctor, right?
Makes sense.
And again, Jonas, the fact that it's highlighted in red, it means that I need to define my attributes. So I'm going to do that here. So I'm going to create a namespace called user, and inside I'm going to create an attribute called role. And if I'm too lazy, I can actually just do a bit of copy pasting. So it's really, really fast. So of course that describes the user is going to be subject. This is going to be user.role. The data type is going to be the same, which is good. I'm going to indent this little thing here. There we go. Now this attribute's been resolved. I need to do the same for username. And there's going to be username. There we go. And then finally, yep, go ahead, Jonas.
I think what you're doing here is sort of, this is where ALFA really, it sounds a little bit cheesy, but where it really shines. But you know, the fact that you can do copy and paste and do these things here, it's really, really fast to do and define all these new attributes and things like that. This, you know, UIs in all its honor and you know, being simple, it would take much longer to do the same thing in any type of UI in terms of point and clicking and things like that.
So let's give this example a go. Let's go ahead and push it out to my authorization service. I'm going to right click again. I'm going to upload my policy, click yes, package and upload. I'm going to choose my default project again. I'm going to choose an existing domain, my sample domain, click OK, push it out. It's been pushed out. And then I'm going to go to my little UI. I'm going to go back out just to refresh that screen, do send a PEP request. And now we're going to have four attributes show up: the user role, the username, the object type, and the assigned doctor. So
just explain, just with a few simple sort of sentences, where do these attributes come from here in this tool?
So yeah, for sure. So what the tool does, it actually connects to the services manager. It downloads the policy. It looks at the policy and understands which attributes are being used. So then what it does is it says, hey, these are all the attributes in the policies that might play a role. So if you create an authorization request, you might want to pass in a value for those attributes. It doesn't mean that you have to, but most likely you will need to. So given that we have a single policy right now, it's found those attributes being used in the policy, and it's telling you, hey, you might want to pass a value for those attributes.
Right. So it's basically indicating all the attributes that are used somewhere in the policy. And to your point, you don't necessarily, I mean, if you have a large policy, you don't necessarily have to pass in values for all those attributes just to get a decision out of it, but you get an idea of what attributes that are used in the policy.
Right. Yep. And the cool thing is that it helps you generate tests for your policies. So it's a really neat testing tool from that perspective. So I'm going to say that I'm a doctor. My name is Alice. I'm trying to get access to a medical record. And the assigned doctor is going to be Alice as well. So if I send that, the expected result should be a permit, right?
Yep.
And it is. But if for some reason the assigned doctor is not Alice, then the response might not be a permit. It's actually something called not applicable. But not applicable is kind of not necessarily that human friendly. So maybe we want to get rid of the not applicable. So we could just add another rule and say here, rule, deny everything else. Meaning that if it didn't apply with the first one, it's going to deny. But if I do that, Jonas, I need to change my combining algorithm, right?
If you have deny overrides, it's always going to trigger the deny decision, even if there's a permit there first. So yeah, you probably want to do first applicable.
So I'm going to call this my safety harness. There we go. And I'm going to deploy this again. So it's really cool to see how instant it is to just make changes to your policies as your scenarios evolve. And if I now send this, I get access denied.
Very cool and very simple.
Yeah.
I mean, we didn't spend that much time in writing the policy, pushing the policy, and actually sending that. So behind the scenes, though, we are obviously not using, we're using a client-side tool here. What we're showcasing out of those 3 building blocks is you can see at least that it is JSON here, but you can't necessarily see that it's posting this to the REST interface, but it is behind the scenes. So we have all sort of the building blocks that we talked about from a simplicity perspective, right?
Yeah.
We have authored the policy in Alpha. We using our sort of tool here, X-Ray, are constructing the JSON request, and it's posting it to our authorization engine that has that policy in place.
Yep.
Via REST, and then we get a JSON response back as well. This is one of the more common use cases that we see, right? Is the relational type of policy, and that's essentially what we showcased here. There are other examples of this. Here we did sort of a patient doctor type of assignment, but it can also be you can only approve transactions in your own country or location or state or something like that.
Right.
Or it could be related to department. You can only view certain records for your own department or what have you, right? Or another example is this sort of segregation of duty of approving purchase orders that you created yourself or things like that. So there's many different types of relational use cases. I think that's the more common sort of scenarios that we see in different type of verticals. They have different sort of shapes and forms.
Yeah. So on that note, if you have any questions, please shoot them over to us. You can use the tooling around this video to do that. You can also tweet to us at Axiomatics or just send plain old email. Thanks, and stay tuned.
Yeah, thanks, David.
All right, thanks, Jonas.